This training is in accordance with the principles identified in the API Recommended Practice 1169, second edition, March 2020, for pipeline construction inspection. This version of the training is in accordance with Canadian regulatory requirements and is deemed a suitable preparation for API 1169 exams based on Canadian legal requirements. U.S. reference material is also provided for those wishing to use this training as preparation for the U.S. API 1169 exams, which are based on U.S. legal requirements as the principles are universal. We're going to talk about that. One of the things that's really important for inspectors, there's a lot of information running around in the field, and a lot of it is inaccurate. So one of the things that we will do in this course is make sure that you have a clear understanding of what the field is and what the requirements are for training and credentials. Z662 is open in terms of it allows the company to choose the appropriate training and qualifications. So the company can choose whose version of an API certificate, if they even want an API certificate, they can choose whose version they want, but there are very specific prescriptive requirements. And so if your company is not running an in-house exam and they're choosing to accept an external credential, there's no problem doing that, but they have to meet that credential and make sure that that credential meets specific requirements. Now, a lot of times you'll hear us talk about the Canadian deviations to the API 1169. It's fairly important to understand the context of this. The API 1169 is a recommended practice for pipeline inspectors. This means essentially that it's saying this is what a general pipeline inspector should know. And so it includes both uh, principles, right, and examples of technical requirements. Now, most of the examples of technical requirements are US. It's a US-based document, but the principles are universal. Okay, so that's the first thing to remember. A lot of countries use the API 1169, the document, right, because of the principles and then they establish their training and examination systems based on the principles in the 1169, but using their own technical requirements. And again, we're gonna talk about this in detail in this course. The second thing to consider is that as a recommended practice, most of the things it's bringing forward, it's saying an inspector should do this, or an inspector should do that, right? It's recommendations. When you actually apply it in your jurisdiction, you have to go through and pull out anything that they're recommending and change it to mandatory if it's an obligation. Because you don't want the inspectors running around saying, well, I've got my copy of the 1169 and it says I should do this, but I don't feel like it. And because it's only a recommendation, I don't have to. Right? Whereas the legal requirements say, no, here in our jurisdiction, this is mandatory. So we put a table up and we just want to look at some of the elements that are in the 1169 and the differences between Canada and the US. So one of the things that the API 1169 document says is that inspectors should be fluent, right? Trained, qualified, experienced in the use of the regulations for the jurisdiction, right? So in our case, we're talking about national regulations. In Canada, this is a mandatory requirement, and in the US, it's also a mandatory requirement. Okay. The second thing that they'd say is that inspectors should be fluent with the management systems, right? A pipeline safety management system, or in Canada, a safety and loss management system. Now, it's interesting here. In the US, that is only a recommendation. The PHMSA requirements say that companies must have a management system, but they don't detail a framework that must be used. I ran into this a few years ago. One of the courses that we put on in Houston, because we do train on the US side as well, exactly the reverse of this course where everything is focused on the US requirements. And one of the things that we had put in the brochure was the mandatory API 1173 requirements. Now, the problem is we got a letter from API saying, please don't do that. You're going to get us in trouble. Our requirements, 1173 is a recommended practice. It is not mandatory. Don't have our customers thinking that somehow our recommended practice is now a legal requirement. They'll all get mad because we promised them when we developed this that it would always be an option. So we had to say the recommendations. But those requirements in Canada are not recommendations. They are absolutely ironclad mandatory. And in fact, in this training, we will spend a good portion of one day going through the pipeline safety and loss management system for use in Canada because it is a mandatory minimum legal requirement and it applies to all jurisdictions in Canada, federal and provincial. Okay. The next thing that the 1169 talks about is inspector types. The 1169 is a recommended practice for general inspectors, and it acknowledges that there's other inspector levels out there, but it provides a couple one-pagers. And so it's a recommendation that companies do this. In Canada, again, it's mandatory. There is a clause in Z662 that mandates that the company identify the number and type of inspectors for each project. And of course, that has to include their training and qualification. Okay. Um, Knowledge of the Z662. It's a recommendation in the U.S. that inspectors be knowledgeable of the codes and standards for that they're applying. It's a mandatory requirement in Canada. So the B51 for facilities and the ASME 31 B31, both of those in Canada, it's mandatory that inspectors be knowledgeable of the use of those documents and competent or qualified in the use of those documents. The ASME 31 series is also kind of interesting because it's the U.S. code requirements, right? And we reference certain pieces of those code requirements, but it's not a full reference where we say, go use this document. It's a reference where we say, well, in this circumstance, on this day, if it's raining, you can use this section of this document. So they're very specific references to parts of the 31 series that can be used, and inspectors have to be fluent with that. And you'll notice the little NA with note number 2, and we're going to look at the notes on the next slide. The B51 has the pressure vessel registration requirements. Now that's not identified in the 1169 because, of course, the U.S. system doesn't have those pressure vessel registration requirements as part of the pipeline system. In Canada, we do. Now, on the other side, the 1169 has blasting requirements as something that U.S. inspectors should know. On the Canadian side, we say, hey, that's not applicable on our side. It's a separate discipline that's federally regulated, et cetera, et cetera. Next thing down is right-of-way requirements. It's mandatory that inspectors be familiar with sections 6 and 8 of the Z662, and of course it's recommended on the US side. Welding is a little bit interesting. It is recommended on the US side, and the general examination in the US includes a lot of welding questions because they don't have the level 4 subject matter expertise system within their realm. On the Canadian side, of course, the recommendations for welding knowledge of general inspectors, it's recommended, but it's not tested because we have a number of programs for welding inspectors, including the level 4 on the CPAC system, the 178.2 in the CWB system, and there are others available as well. Knowledge of testing. That is mandatory, and this is the last one we're going to look at it on this slide. And I really want to point out there are major differences between the testing protocols for Canadian pipelines and US pipelines. Okay, now this is one of the ones that if you're writing a US exam, you must learn the US requirements, okay, in order to pass that exam because the Canadian requirements are different. If you're writing the Canadian exam, do not use US study materials or US practice exams. They will mess you up because you'll get exam questions that talk about the testing of pipelines. And if you answer them from any kind of memory of your US studies, you'll get them wrong. The testing protocols, right, in Canada and the US are very, very different. Now, I wouldn't say that one is better and one is worse. They're just different. They are designed specifically to match the design and construction standards used in the countries. So just to recap the notes, note number one, the API 1173 in the US is voluntary, whereas the Section 3 of the Z662 in Canada is mandatory. CRN number systems are not used in the US, but inspectors in Canada must be fluent with those systems and how they work. Item number three is mandatory where referenced or modified. Item number four was Canada mandates subject matter experts for welding inspection, whereas in the US there's more of a suggestion that general inspectors can do it. And then five, of course, testing in Canada and the US are very, very different. Participants are expected to have legal access, copies, or license for the use of proprietary documents such as the Z662, the CAP 2009, and the Practical Guide for Pipeline Inspectors as a condition of training. Now, some of these documents are freely available. The freely available documents we've provided in your download. And the Z662 is also freely available for individual licensing, and we've provided a link for that. So, of course, in the training, we have to provide the disclaimer that we don't necessarily have the rights to those documents and you have to have the permissions, but we're able to provide those permissions as part of the training. So handouts, downloads are for reference purposes and contain material freely available on the internet. The slide text includes only partial or abridged elements for the context and training, where the entire verbatim text would be required for proper application in the field. A number of times we've come across people who have done a really good job of paying attention and taking copious notes during the training, which is not a bad thing. It's an important thing. But then in the field, they start applying their notes without checking the actual context in the standard as it applies to their situation. A lot of times we'll use a clause in the standard to demonstrate an idea or a concept as part of the training, but to actually apply it in the field, you need to know what the clause before it said or what the clause after it requires in addition. So keep it into perspective that when you're applying things in the field or to your role, that you should be doing it directly out of the current regulations, codes, and standards. So any reference to a code clause where text is shown on the slide or the training slide may be editorial or incomplete when compared to the actual document. Full text of the actual document should always be referred to for field application and decision making.